Welcome to the But She's Your Mother podcast, where we talk about all things related to being raised by narcissistic parents. Our guests are adult survivors of child abuse. Please note that this podcast is intended for mature audiences and may feature topics such as emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, domestic violence, self-harm, suicide, murder, and eating disorders. Opinions expressed by guests and survivors are their own. Some names may be changed or blocked out to protect minors, victims, and survivors. Thank you for listening to But She's Your Mother, the podcast. Today's guest is J.D. McCabe. JD is a domestic violence survivor and the author of The Third Gift, My Dance with the Devil and Her Mother. Welcome, JD.
Marnie, I am very honored and privileged to be here. Thank you for opening up your platform to me. I'm a first-time author of a book called The Third Gift, My Dance with the Devil and Her Mother, where I lay out my journey of surviving arsenic poisoning, but I think at the highest level being a domestic abuse survivor of someone that either has narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. I have not been able to discern which one it actually is. And on top of that, I believe Munchausen syndrome. So the story is extremely complex and complicated, but I'm thankful every day to still be alive.
Welcome, JD, and I'm sorry for what you've been through. And interesting, just as a beginning note, and then we're going to get into the questions. When I was reading your book, I was listening to it. My first thought was Munchausen based on what she was doing. So I tend to agree with you there. Not a diagnostician, but she definitely has the markers for that. So let's get into it. Tell me how your relationship began. What was it like in the beginning? How did you meet?
Playing on a slow pitch softball team, so one of the third baseman, his wife brought her out. I didn't know that she was there to meet me. We ended up meeting. We chatted a little while after the game, and I would come to find out that, and I was 26 at the time, come to find out that she had been previously married for 8 weeks. And immediately my gut said, I don't want anything to do with this. Whether it's judgmental or being naive and young and immature, I'm like, I don't want anything to do with this. She was very attractive. But I didn't call her for 3 months. And then I would run into her in a bar in Pittsburgh. And as they would say, the rest is history. We started dating. We dated for about 1.5 to 2 years, and we were engaged. And then we were married, of all days, September 11th, 1993. And so, in the first 17 years of it, as I knew it then, again, based on my lens at the time and my age, everything was fairly normal, fairly stable, fairly happy. I built a family, built my career. We had moved a couple of times for my job. We had 2 beautiful children who are now young adults, my son, Billy, my daughter, Katie. So I would say that things were relatively stable. Looking back, I have a different perspective now after going through what I went through. But at the time, I would just chalk it up as it was fairly normal marriage. But then things started to turn with subtle accusations on her part of infidelity and drug addiction and so forth, so on. And things would really unfold when her mother would get involved, thus the subtitle of the book, And Her Mother. And I loved both of these women unconditionally. And the mother and her, they turned on me like a cobra. And the spring of 2014 was when just everything really started to come apart. And so every accusation that she made against me about infidelity and drug addiction and so forth, so on, she was actually doing, I would later discover.
When did you know, okay, I got to get out of this? What was the turning point where you were like, oh, this is not going to get better?
As I said at the opening, I think it was very complex. The complicating thing for me is I started to see signs and symptoms or concern of her paranoia and her delusions. And I would also spend 9 days in a psychiatric facility involuntarily committed. We can talk about that and how she set me up for that. But believe it or not, Marnie, it wasn't until we went to our first mediation. We were separated in the States. In North Carolina, they prefer mediation versus going through the backlog court system. It was at our first mediation when she made the revelation or the accusation I gave her sexually transmitted herpes. That was when I finally realized this is over. You know, God intervened and smacked me across the face and said, son, your marriage is over. Because believe it or not, going into that, I still had no clarity as to really what was going on in the marriage. I was attributing a lot of what I was seeing with her mood swings, her emotional outbursts, her anger, her delusions. I was contributing that to all of her alleged autoimmune disease, which, as you've listened to the book, you discovered that it wasn't true. It was all fabricated. It was all in her mind. So that was the clouding thing for me. But ultimately, the accusation that I gave her sexually transmitted herpes, it was like, oh my God. And I immediately began to dig into medical claims and pharmacy claims, and I discovered her hidden prescription drug addiction. I discovered massive infidelity on her part. And I discovered one secret after another, including that she used our children for 2 years to supplement her amphetamine prescriptions to the tune of 600 days worth across 20 months. And it was just one revelation after another. And I think that's why the title of the book is perfect, because of, the title of the third gift, because had she never made that accusation, I would never have looked. I never suspected that she would be out cheating on me. I would never suspect that she had a drug addiction, because again, I attributed a lot of those things and her tiredness, and she would be in bed at 8:30 every night. And I'm like, there's no way, because folks would say to me, you sure she's not cheating on you? And I would dismiss it and go, no, she's in bed every night at 8:30 from her alleged autoimmune disease. Well, I would later discover it's from taking amphetamines and then benzodiazepines at nighttime, So it's I guess what they call prescription speedballing. So I don't know where I'd be today without that revelation. And believe it or not, I am forever grateful to her uh, for the depths of her evil and for just being that greedy and thinking that she had given that to me. She was certain she had infected me. There's no other way that she would have revealed that.
So it sounds like when you got to mediation, you got another piece of evidence that made you really look backwards at what was actually going on throughout the years during the decline of your relationship. But you wouldn't have been in mediation if it wasn't bad enough already to put you in a position where you guys were starting to negotiate a divorce. So going backwards, what was the beginning of the decline? Because I remember that you said that she started to make these accusations. Was she already suffering from the autoimmune disease prior to that? Like, what came
Yeah.
first?
The autoimmune disease kind of became her identity, shall I say, probably 6, 7 years into the marriage. When she was complaining of certain symptoms, and she would start going to see specialist after specialist, and I would be there right by her side. But the autoimmune disease came first before any of the it probably came 8, 9, 10 years before the wheels really started to unravel. But as I looked back at the medical claims and the pharmacy claims, it may have occurred earlier, but her infidelity and her hidden prescription drug addiction began at the exact same time that she started accusing me subtly of cheating on her and of doing drugs. And so the autoimmune disease, there's some things that occurred with that happened earlier in our marriage.
So really, if we look backwards now, the first 17 years of your marriage wasn't stable. Your wife was consistently sick with an illness that she was causing for herself, and getting your attention and your care and a fix from you that might have been placating her enough not to seek it elsewhere. That's what
That
it sounds like to me.
I believe, and again, I'm not a therapist, I'm not an expert in the field, but I've become pretty well educated. But I believe the arsenic poisoning, when she was poisoning me with the arsenic, was a Munchausen by proxy. Because
Mm.
I sit back and I think now I lost a ton of weight, and I had all sorts of crazy symptoms, evaluated for leukemia, Lou Gehrig's early onset of Parkinson's. I mean, I went through the medical ringer trying to figure out what was going on. And I'll never forget Marnie. She would mock me. She would say, we are going to figure this out. We're going to get to the bottom of your weight loss. We're going to figure all of these things out. and I will stand, I will stand by you. Yet she was the one more than likely that was putting it in my protein powder. And I say more than likely she was, but I don't have any direct evidence linking it to her because I didn't discover the arsenic poisoning until about a year after we separated. And she had destroyed phones and computers, and the protein powder was long gone. So yeah, the Munchausen's was probably there long before everything else that was revealed.
When you were being tested for all of these other things because you didn't know that you were being poisoned with arsenic, which ultimately you found that out because there was a test that let you know that that was what was happening. Was she going to the hospital with you? Was she holding your hand? Was she there for the test? Like, what did that look like?
She went on some of them. And I'll never forget it. I can visualize it today. This is a great question. She went with me to my first oncology appointment. And at the time, I had just recently been released from well, let me think back on this. At the time of that appointment, I had been removed. I had been discharged from my involuntary commitment at a psych hospital. I had been misdiagnosed with bipolar 2. So we're meeting with the oncologist. She was super concerned about my elevated white blood cell count. She was very clear that she knew about the separation, the pending separation, all that we've been through. She was very clear that stress has nothing to do with your current medical condition. My soon-to-be ex-wife was very clear with her when she asked about medications, because I was taking a very low dose of clonazepam at the time, very low dose. And she asked me about medications. As she's asking me, and my ex-wife says, "Oh, he has bipolar 2. He takes that because he has bipolar 2. He was just released from a psychiatric facility." So she was less than supportive. And then there would be times when I'd go to these follow-up appointments on my own. I would come home and she would, I kid you not, she looked at me and said, "You're dying of cancer and I'm going to have to get a job. I'm going to have to take over everything around here." I mean, she said it quite proudly. Like, "You're dying of cancer." And then she asked me, "If you are terminally ill, will your employer fire you? Will you lose your job?" I'm like, what are you talking about?" She said, "Well, I just need to know if I need to, take over, if I need to really get serious about looking for a full-time job."
What was your life insurance plan like?
That was not super robust. It was $375,000. Not enough, a significant piece significant chunk of change, but more importantly, and this is why, again, it's all circumstantial, she never took an interest in our finances. I paid the bills, I managed the finances. She never cared to do any of that. But out of the blue, probably around the time that I would later discover that I was being poisoned, she wanted a list. She played it off that, hey, she was seeing a therapist because of her father's death. And as you listen to, that's another complicating factor with her. She said, "I need to know what kind of finances we have. What are our investments? What does your retirement look like?" And of course, I laid it all out for her. So there was a substantial amount of money to be gained if I were to disappear, for sure.
Yeah. And so before the arsenic poisoning was the bipolar 2, excuse me, diagnosis. Start at the beginning of that. What even put you in a position to end up seeing somebody for that disorder? What were the symptoms that you were experiencing, for example, if any? Tell the story around that, if you will, please.
I'd be happy to. And this was all occurring in the spring of 2014 when I started working out, and I'm certain that's when she began the arsenic poisoning. But it intensified in our home around the infidelity, the drug accusations, and then, of course, starting to work out and being poisoned with arsenic and losing weight quite rapidly. It only further cemented her story with her mother, known as a negative advocate out there, I guess, or some people call them flying monkeys. But that was the spring of 2014. I started working out, losing weight, and she's like, "Look," I can only imagine her saying to her mother, "Look, he's losing weight, he's getting in shape. He's either doing drugs or he's cheating on me, one of the two." We went on a beach trip in June with her mother, her brother. She just got one brother, and a very small trip, just her family, myself, and my two kids. And it was on that trip that my now ex-mother-in-law threatened to kill me. threatened to kill me out of the blue, said, if you put your hands on my daughter, I will kill you. Suggested that I was addicted to porn, I was addicted to drugs. There's something that occurred in your childhood, Danny. You need to dig deep and figure out what that was. And of course, I was knocked off my feet by going, where is all of this coming from? And, she never, her mother or her, never wanted to communicate about what was going on. So that was in June. We had a hellish summer with continued abuse, continued gaslighting, continued projections. You name it. I was pushed to the brink of insanity. I was doing everything I could to hang on to my family. As they say, the devil attacks your strength and turns it into your weakness. My strength was my love for my family, my kids, and the family unit we built. And the thought of that being destroyed, the thought of separation goes against everything that, I ever believed in. But I said to her, if you think I got a mood disorder, if you think I've got anger issues or whatever, I said, I'll be happy to go see a psychiatrist. I went to a psychiatrist September 9th, 2014, 2 days before what would have been our 21st wedding anniversary. She graciously went with me. You fill out these BS subjective questionnaires for bipolar 2, talk about kind of what's going on in the house. And this guy in less than 30 minutes says, sounds like bipolar 2. I'm going to put you on this particular medication. So that was September 9th.
Your wife came with you to the screening for the bipolar 2. What part did she play in that appointment? Was she in there when you were talking about things like what's going on in the house? And if so, what were the things that she was saying were happening?
So with the subjective questionnaires that you may be familiar with, the 10 questions, she filled out, checked every box. Yes, yes, yes. He's got mood. He's got heightened moods. He'll go from periods of being angry with anger outbursts to then coming back to the house with, very calm, very cool, very collected. Well, yeah, when things would get heated in the home, I removed myself from the house. I'm like, I'm not going to stick around here. I'm not going to let you push me to the point of where I now believe she wanted me to physically put my hands on her so she could get me out of the home. So she would feed into that with this guy that, he's got mood swings. He's got anger outbursts. Whenever we argue, he gets real busy cleaning. I think it's mania. I've done some research online. And so she was just feeding the fire. And my stance on it was, yeah, Mr. Psychiatrist, doctor, there's been an awful lot of tension in the home. There's been an awful lot of false accusations with no merit that I'm constantly dealing with her coming at me about infidelity and drug addiction and so forth, so on. And that was September 9th. And then I would later discover, as we moved forward down the road to our alimony trial and all that, she was writing letters behind my back to that psychiatrist. And she was writing letters behind my back to the family practitioner that ultimately would begin treating me for my weight loss and for the symptoms from the arsenic poisoning. 2 days before my involuntary commitment, when I drove to Charlotte, North Carolina to meet with my son, who was in college, because I'd already lost my daughter. She was living in the home, but she wanted nothing to do with me. And I said, I need to go see my son to make sure that he hears from me that I'm not cheating on his mother. I love his mother and I'm not doing drugs. And I need you to stand by me and believe me. And as a father, you never expect to have that conversation with one of your children. And while I was down there, unbeknownst to her, because she had left the house the night before because she called the cops on me, alleging that I was suicidal. This was a couple of days after my diagnosis. So the chips were starting to come into play for her. Everything was coming together very nicely. The cops did show up. I told them I was concerned about her paranoia, her delusions because of her autoimmune disease. So she didn't come home that night. I didn't sleep. And I left early for Charlotte. And then when I got back from Charlotte and came back to the house, she asked me where I was. And for a couple of seconds, maybe a minute, I didn't tell her that I went to see our son because I didn't want her to know. And then I told her and she exploded and said, you're a pathological liar, with my daughter right there sitting with her in the kitchen. You're a pathological liar. We've never had trust in this marriage because of you. We're done. I mean, she said it more explosively than that. And that's when we got back to talking about more of the separation. That following Monday, So I had the cops called on me, went to see my son. That following Monday, I go to see my family practitioner for a follow-up to all the weight loss because the weight continued to pour off. I was probably up to 50 pounds of weight loss at this point, and I was experiencing tingling and all sorts of physical symptoms that I couldn't explain. She again graciously went with me and laid out for him all the events of the weekend. And this guy with his back turned to me, I kid you not, Marnie, he back turned to me as he's typing on his little computer, said, sounds like bipolar 2. And if you don't go to such and such psychiatric hospital, I'll have you involuntarily committed. It was just that easy. So I would spend 3 days at a psychiatric or at a acute care hospital that had a psych ward, but I was stuck in their emergency department for 3 days. And then I had a police transport to the dedicated psych hospital that I was dearly trying to avoid because it was not a great place to be. So I would spend 9 days across 2 different facilities. And again, later discovered that 2 days before my involuntary commitment, she wrote a letter to my family practitioner, wrote a letter to my psychiatrist, chock full of lies and nonsense. And I'm certain that that's probably what led the family practitioner in less than 2 minutes go, sounds like you need to be involuntarily committed. Because he asked me at that appointment, and I was a hollowed out man. At that point, I was a broken man. I was emotionally confused. Had been enduring 6-9 months of abuse from her and her mother. And the mistake that I made, of course, which for any of your listeners is I told nobody. I told nobody what was going on.
If you had told somebody, what would you say to them? What would you say to them that you would have felt would have made a difference and be believed and all of that? Because pretty clearly she was going behind the scenes, talk about a smear campaign, and really methodically launching a smear campaign to position herself in a place where if a divorce goes down, she takes everything and you're locked up in a psych ward. So what would you have said if you could go back? How would you have handled that in
If I
that
could go,
same circumstance, that same way?
if I could go back, it would have been my brother Al, and probably his wife Jane, because once I got locked up in the psych facility, I come from a large family. I've got 5 brothers and 3 sisters. I didn't pull them all in, but a couple of my brothers came to town just to see what the hell is going on. How the hell did he get involuntarily committed? And they met with my social worker. Myself and my 2 brothers met with my social worker. My now ex-wife couldn't be bothered to attend that appointment, even though my 2 brothers said, hey, we're going to, called her multiple times. We're meeting at this time. We're meeting at this time. We'd love your insight, da, da, da. She never showed. But anyhow, if I could go back, it would be my brother and his wife. They're my heroes. They stood by me throughout all this. They stood by myself and my kids. I would have laid it all. I would have laid some of it out to say, hey, look, here's the accusations that she's making against me. And I know my brother would have looked me in the eye and said, are you doing any of it? And I know he would have said, then perhaps she's the one that's doing it. Because it was my sister-in-law, after things began to unfold, she's got a PhD in nursing. Once I was out of the house, she says, I think she's been poisoning you. You need to go get heavy metal tested and tested for arsenic and so forth, so on. The initial test showed nothing because it was a blood test. And you need a hair and nail test to show chronic exposure, which is how I would diagnose it sometime later. But if I talked to them, I would have been broken out of, I would have had some objectivity. I would have had an objective voice saying to me, look, I know you're not doing drugs. I know, and I trust you, but you need to look into her. And he said it more than once after he became knowledgeable about what was going on. He's like, you sure she's not running around on you? And of course I dismissed it because I'm like, no, she's in bed every night at 8:00, 8:30. She's wiped out from her alleged autoimmune disease. Yeah. So that's what I would say to your listeners is find an objective voice, somebody
Yeah.
that can ask insightful questions to break you out of the tunnel vision that I had. And I was just emotionally twisted and confused and couldn't think straight, period.
How did you get out of the psych ward and how many days were you there in total? Next time on But She's Your Mother.
And I would spend another 6 days in this dedicated psych facility. She only came and visited me twice. And the only reason she came the second time was she had to come to meet with my inpatient social worker, who I got very little time with because they wanted to assess the safety in the home because of what they were hearing from her. So while I'm in there, she's working behind my back with nurses and social workers and pumping them with all sorts of information that she's afraid and your daughter's afraid for her safety.